Welcome to the first of the 2017 Divinity Dialogues, sponsored by the HDS Alumni Council. I'm Margaret Rose, chair of this year's council, and our first meeting of the school year starts tomorrow. So I want to thank my fellow members of the council for being here, and especially to thank you for your presence and your hard work for those of you who've been here in the past, and for new members, the hard work that is yet to come. And also especially thank you to Dean Hampton for being here and for supporting all the work that we are doing and what's happening here at the Divinity School. I'm an MDiv graduate from 1979, so I am grateful for my years as a council member and in the ways I've gotten to know the Divinity School today. I've appreciated the vibrant ways the Divinity School connects theological education with the world beyond the academy, especially now in an ever more diverse religious and political landscape. And so tonight we hold the first installment of Divinity Dialogues for this academic year. Since 2012, Divinity Dialogues programs organized by the council have been an opportunity to hear from alumni and their work in the years since studying here at HDS. They've been hosted here on campus and around the country, New York, Washington, and San Francisco. Our themes have been diverse and wide-ranging, focusing on such vital issues as healing, risk, service, and tonight, public voice. How do religious traditions, our faiths, call us to engage in the public square? What ways do our diverse voices enter the conversation, especially across religious and political divides? And how do we use the tools of theological education for this work? In a recent Wall Street Journal article, an editorial, John DeLulio of the University of Pennsylvania is quoted. "Religion can be a tremendously and uniquely powerful civic tonic, and a tremendously and uniquely destructive civic toxin." Tonight, we hear from alumni whose faith and courage has compelled them to speak and act in the public arena, and whose voices, I am sure, will inspire our own. I'm pleased now to turn this over to my colleague on the AAC, Susie Hayward, MDiv 07, who will moderate this session and who was herself in Charlottesville on August 12th. Over to you.
Thank you, Margaret Rose. And thank you to all of you for showing up. It's great to be here, and I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation. And I'm especially grateful to the chair of our Alumni Council for choosing this theme of public voice to guide us throughout the year. I was here as a student not long after September 11th, and this question of what role religious scholars and clergy and people of faith should play in talking about religion in the public square was fiercely debated, and there was a lot of disagreements about it, about whether to engage in the public sphere on religion, about how to engage in the public sphere, about how to do so in a way that can ensure the integrity of the complexity and the nuance of religion, when oftentimes what folks want to hear in the public square isn't the granular details, isn't the gray areas that we often focus on here. But there was also a strong conviction that there was a need to be out in the public square, and a recognition of the ways in which religion in the public square has served as a tonic, even as it served as a toxin, and a sense of moral obligation that as religion scholars, there was a role for us to play in helping to ensure some of that tonic around the country. So how much more so are these debates going on today with what's going on in our country? And I think that they reflect more broadly some of the debates that have gone on within our religious traditions for a long time. The prophetic impulse that's within the Abrahamic traditions, certainly, in obvious ways, but also in Buddhism and in Hinduism, the ways in which religious figures, scriptural precedents, the legacies and the stories within religious traditions have shown important figures engaging with political figures. Engaging on issues of governance and issues of human rights and the dignity of all. But those prophetic impulses within traditions are sometimes supported by and sometimes constrained by the priestly and the pastoral and the other elements of religion that are debated as people figure out how to respond to suffering in the world and to situations of injustice. So I'm very excited to be thinking about those questions in response to a particular event. Very complex questions that we can perhaps grasp a little bit more fully or grapple with a little bit more easily in situ. And I'm very glad to have with us today 3 alumni who can help speak to, particularly on August 12th in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the events leading up to it and the events in the aftermath, how these questions of religion in the public space and in response to public issues and injustice and suffering were grappled with. We have with us today Tracy Howe Wispelwey, who is an MDiv graduate from 2012. She's the Minister of Congregational and Community Engagement with the Justice and Witness Ministries of the United Church of Christ and is a resident in Charlottesville. We have Jalane Schmidt, who is a PhD from 2005, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, so also a resident of Charlottesville.
And I have my MDiv from...
Oh, and MDiv, I'm sorry. Right. MDiv 96. Right. And to my left here, Willie Bodrick, who is an MDiv from 2014, who lives here in Boston, in Roxbury, serving as the Youth Development and Young Adults Associate Pastor of Preaching Teaching of Youth Development and Young Adults at the 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury. And so they're going to help us think about some of these questions in the lead up to on the day of August 12th and in the aftermath around the country. So I have 3 sets of questions that I want to engage all of you on in this discussion before we open it up to Q&A. But first I'd like to start by having all of you tell us a little bit about what led you to respond to the events on August 12th in the way you did, in the lead up to or in the aftermath. Tracy, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure. So glad to be here and just thrilled and to be here with Jalane and see some familiar faces. Being someone who lived in Charlottesville, I think, first of all, we very much felt like, things were just happening to us. But as a person of faith, I believe as a Christian that the action of God's love can be known in the person of Jesus, and that we are called to embody the action of God's love, and that the life and death of Jesus is entwined in state violence and the struggle against empire and state violence. So that's where I locate myself as a Christian and someone who seeks to embody the action of love. In terms of inviting people to respond in Charlottesville, in particular working to organize clergy, the invitation was in response to an acute pastoral need that was surfaced by a violent, or an inbreaking of violent ideology and presence. So the invitation was around responding to that pastoral need, and then there was my faith tradition that mobilized me as well.
Thank you. Jalane?
Well, thank you for having me, and it's helpful for my own processing and also for folks back home, I think, when some of us do discuss this in some public forums and hope to, the things that have happened to us in Charlottesville are applicable far afield from Charlottesville, I think, and we'll get more into that discussion later on. But why did I get involved, or how did I respond the way I did? I'm a Christian, and I take seriously the good news, evangelium. That this is a public pronouncement. It's meant to take place in public. That is to announce, freedom for captives, good news to the poor, etc. And so, to not hide my light under a bushel, and particularly in looking at all the structures of violence, the violent institutions that structure our very daily life. I think it's important for me as a Christian, as part of my Christian witness, to be doing this work in a public place, to kind of bearing witness to the way of justice. And so that's what led me. That's part of what led my response. What's going on in Charlottesville, I mean, what shows up in the media are the kind of the larger eruptions that are considered more newsworthy. If it bleeds, it leads, unfortunately. But in the reality is that for the past year and a half, there's been a kind of almost weekly, in some months, almost weekly, just different skirmishes, in our downtown areas and these sorts of things. So the kind of continuing response on a weekly basis to things going on in the streets with these far-right groups coming to town, as well as dealing with public officials in public forums such as city council meetings or hearings or this sort of thing, and how to and then organizing other activists to respond has been the big learning curve of my life, and something that I'm still kind of drawing on. Some of the training here about thinking about what does it mean to look at aspects of public life that need to be addressed, and how to respond in a very kind of volatile situation.
Thank you. Willie, you were here in Boston.
I was.
Watching what was happening on August 12th, and then part of the response that happened not long after. Can you tell us about what led you to respond in the way you did?
Yes. So it's good to be back at HDS. Good to see so many familiar faces. The first thing that came to my mind, honestly, was just we won't go back. We won't go back. The impetus to think critically about how do you respond was the first thing, was not really what to actually say, but to know that I had to say something. And wrestling with that notion, I then began to delve into, well, what do I draw upon? And what rang in my ear were the words of the prophet Micah. It says, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. And for me, that sets the frameworks for the work that we do. To talk about the public work, you have to start with what is your mission? Is to do justice and to love mercy. And so for me, I knew that something had to be said, because I believe we've been building to this moment all along. I remember Sandra Bland. I remember Rakia Boyd. I remember sitting literally right over there when I was the only voice who said something, we're not going to let this day go by without talking about Trayvon Martin. And so this isn't new. I think one of the things that, is surprising to me is how shocked we are. But this isn't a new moment. We've been seeing this moment and this tension in this country build and build and build. And so we've come to some sort of a peak where the rubber has sort of met the road. And so now I think what forced me to speak was that I've been working towards saying that, at some point, hopefully my voice is going to mean something. But we know that we are trying to move not only this country, but move as a people in a collective direction so that all people have equitable rights, have access, have protection, not just under the law, but just basic human rights. And so for me, it started from thinking critically about the history of the African-American tradition in this country, and saying those voices like James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and King and Malcolm and so many others who have shaped a voice of prophetic protest, to say that we don't have to accept the status quo and we won't go back. We just can't. And so for me, that was the premise. And then I went to prayer service on a Friday night. We do peace walks in my community every Friday. And I saw people struggling with what to say about this. Some weren't shocked at all. They said, "Rev, you saw what happened?" I said, "Yeah, I saw what happened." And we shared a chuckle. But others really didn't know what to say, because they thought that They finally beat that monster called racism. They had a nice job. They moved their family into a nice neighborhood. They were able to create safe communities. And lo and behold, rears its ugly head in a form that they would have never expected. Here we're talking about young people marching on the campus. Younger than me, and I think I'm still young. Young people marching on the campus with tiki torches and speaking about in languages that, and talking in terms that were just destroying the notion of what we believed we were as a country. And so what I would suggest is that, we have to respond with a righteous fervor. And I knew that if you stand on what is right, everyone might not like it, but you're speaking for those who may not have the opportunity to speak for themselves.
Thank you. Tracy and Jalane, I know what Willie has said about some people were surprised, and a lot of people weren't surprised about what happened on August 12th will resonate for you in Charlottesville too, because there had been a lot of buildup, a lot of events that took place before August 12th that were precursors to what happened that day. Can you tell us a little bit more about the buildup to August 12th and about how you were involved in some of those responses prior to August 12th?
I could start in 1865.
Okay. Maybe over the summer.
The build-up, yes, right, yeah, right. Well, we've been struggling since February of 2016, actually, having a debate in our community about what to do with some Jim Crow era Confederate monuments that had been installed in the 1920s, and there was a growing and vocal contingent of us in the community that want these statues removed to a museum where they can be more appropriately framed as historical objects rather than as laudatory monuments to men whose ideology we do not embrace. So that had been going on for, since February 2016. Then this was going on during the presidential campaign as, these very, racist demons were being stirred up by the Trump campaign, and then culminating, and then actually one of the biggest meetings of the year of this whole year-long process that we had of having public meetings and hearings and research about these monuments, it occurred 2 days after the Trump election. And it was the biggest attendance to date there, and about 100 of us had matching t-shirts on that said 52%. I stand with the 52%, and the 52% was not Hillary voters, but rather the 52% of our community at the time of the Civil War were enslaved. That is the outright majority of the population of Charlottesville and Albemarle County at the time of the Civil War were slaves, And so those monuments that were put in the 1920s in our town were revisionist history from the very moment they were put in. They were meant to quash the memory of the majority of people in the community who were elated when the Union generals arrived. So anyway, so there was a buildup for a lot, then this was, coinciding with the Trump election, and then our city is, it's about 80% Democratic Party identified, and the mayor declared Charlottesville to be the capital of the resistance, and this is right after inauguration, and then the assaults started on our downtown mall, which is an outdoor pedestrian mall with lots of restaurants and boutiques and this sort of thing, skirmishes between
assaults being white supremacists
Yes.
coming downtown seeking to harass anti-racist organizers or meeting in public spaces to try to I don't know.
Accosting people.
Yeah.
Provoke.
Assaulting restaurant staff and this sort of things. And then in February was the vote by the city council, February the 6th, to it was a divided vote, 3-2, to remove. And this was after a lot of organizing, grassroots organizing in the community by a lot of us to drum people up, to get people to come to meetings, to city council meetings. Our city council meetings, they're full. It's bigger than this. And they're completely full. It's like we're real civics nerds in Charlottesville because it's the land, of Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Monroe are all from the county there, and so it's what we do. We go to a lot of cities, we go to a lot of meetings. But to have this heated debate, for basically going on a year and a half. Is the background of all this. This didn't all just come up on, for instance, May the 13th was when it reached national news, when there was the first of the torch rallies. But
our vice mayor, who's the only black person on council currently, has received numerous death threats, public harassment surrounding this process. So this was all prior to what happened. But then white supremacist, neo-Nazi groups started saying they're going to stand against it. We had our first torchlit rally, which was alarming because there are activists around the country who monitor these groups, and no one knew that that was coming.
That was May 13th.
Yeah. And then from there it was announced that there would be a KKK rally on July 8th, and then the Unite the Right rally, and the alt-right would come on August 12th. And so immediately we mobilized, and organizers were speaking with one another about how to prepare. We knew that we were not prepared. We knew that this was going to be big and increasingly. And I've been a part of direct actions in other cities and in other locations, and I've been a part of training or responses, clergy actions in Ferguson and in Standing Rock. But this, to come into your hometown was something different that I had never dealt with. But even just seeing, and Jalane too has a history of direct action, and we just could sense it, and we immediately started reaching out to national organizers from various organizations and different affiliations. And July 8th happened, and
which was the Klan.
Klan rally, which was a pretty pathetic gathering. The Klan has historical,
on many levels.
In the literal sense, but the Klan has the historical memory, and so it was traumatizing. And a lot of older people were more concerned about this, when a lot of the younger organizers were saying, no, we need to be concerned about the alt-right. But so in a lot of sense for the organizers in town and the different contingencies, there was a very nascent BLM chapter. Black Lives Matter, Surge Showing Up for Racial Justice was about a year old, had been doing a lot of training, but this was like the first kind of action. And then the clergy, who had been meeting since the Charleston shooting, but who had very and I say clergy, those very interfaith group of people, who had a lot of divergent views on what it meant to show up, if they should show up. So July 8th, in a lot of sense, was a kind of a dry run of let's see what's happened, let's see what will happen. And the community was encouraged, and that the community showed up in real ways, and collaborative ways, and all those different groups showed up. But you had a clockwork militarized police response. Clockwork. From tanks to tear gas. I think Jalane was tear gassed, my husband was tear gassed, and he was in full clerical garb all day to break up the protests. And then rhetoric from our elected officials that was the most nonviolent way that they could think to disperse the crowd after they escorted the Klan out from an understandably traumatized group of people that lived there, So seeing the militarized police response then was, a lot of people in the community had not seen that. And so we started preparing, and we worked with, again, national organizers from these groups, Black Lives Matter, Surge, but also brought in organizers from Ferguson, people from the Highlander School, which is where King trained, and we started running weekly Christian peacemaker teams, because at one point our seasoned organizers from Ferguson said, we don't know how to deal with multiple armed actors. We know how to kind of position ourselves against state violence and prepare for that. But when we started preparing for multiple armed actors and kind of the assured presence of violence, we had to bring in people who worked in war-torn countries. And so we were training and we were preparing, and we also were going to meetings with elected officials, telling them to revoke the permit, warning them what would happen. Jalane and I were, people are surprised to find out that what happened on the 12th is exactly what we expected.
People are surprised to learn that we weren't surprised.
Yeah.
We expected even more deaths,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah. And we tried to warn the officials, for weeks, and we had so much evidence, from, all the, social media from these people, and, that we marshaled,
really
screenshotted, and very
threats.
specific. Reams of paper. We produced reports. We're civilians. We all have day jobs. The police aren't doing their job. The FBI apparently isn't either. The press was just so behind the curve. We're a small media market. If it leads, it leads. They can't see a large picture. We were just, hollering to national media, just like, please send help. We're trying to just,
And I'll just say alongside that, so for my part, Jalane and I we were both very active in organizing, but kind of in different contingencies in the city. And as speaking to someone who also was kind of having similar conversations with clergy, who, white clergy specifically too, that were like, surely it's not going to be that bad, or what, are you not, and trying to convey how important it would be to be present for our city.
Yeah, thank you for giving that background. Jalane, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the anxieties and the fears that Tracy just mentioned, that I know are not just among the clergy, but others that kept some people from showing up. Because in retrospect, looking at what happened on August 12th, especially from afar, there's a lot of moral clarity about whether or not to show up. But I know
is there? I would like to hear about that, because I'm kind of in my bubble, and anyway, I'd like to hear that from you, because there's okay.
Yeah, I think for many watching what happened, and I think that the evidence is shown in how many people showed up in Boston for the counter rally there a couple weeks, that showing up was an important thing to do in this moment. Not for all people, for some people.
Right.
But I know also that there were a lot of debates, not just among the clergy, but among others, about whether it was good to show up. When the KKK rally happened on July 8th, the mayor had suggested that it might not be a good idea to show up because it could bring more attention to the KKK. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the arguments that were being made about whether to show up or not?
Yeah. So many officials, both at the university and in the city, our city council members and others, discourage the public from coming to protest. They actively stay home. If you must come out at all, we are going to have these diversionary activities that are far away from the scene of the protest, but just don't go. That was the message. There's no need to protest against this, defunct, morally dead, ideology. They just want attention, so don't fan the flames by going. You're just, feeding the media circus by showing up. And as I've said before, part of what motivates me is making a public witness, that this is something that's to be done in public, And I wasn't worried about the plan, and I was, the only thing I was surprised about with the Klan was I really expected there'd be 10 or 12 of them at most. And often these Klan meetings, they often fizzle out before they happen anyway. They make these big pronouncements, we're going to have a march, and then nobody shows up. And then I expected, there might be 10. I was surprised, there were 40 or 50. I was like, oh, okay. But I wasn't scared of it, because I knew it'd be a small group. And true to form, Charlottesville came out, there were like 1,000 of us counter-protesters, and only 50 of them. But then afterwards, getting attacked by the police, that's what was really infuriating, and frustrating. So people were afraid of showing up. The officials have in mind public safety, which they're supposed to protect public safety, and quite frankly, legal liability. Those are their concerns, not how can I assist my constituents with exercising their constitutional rights to protest. They would rather that you not be there, just for the reasons that I've just stated, liability and safety. So that, and trying to impress upon public officials that no, actually it's important that we exercise our First Amendment rights in this way, by confronting what I called, in the case of the Klan, the collective demons of our racist past and present. That for myself, it was important for me to be there, to stand there facing the Klan, for all those black folk who have come before me, and to be able to look my own children in the eye. It was important for me as a moral agent to stand there. And I also teach about these things as well. So that was important. So a lot of people were afraid, and especially, as Tracy mentioned, older people for whom, when you think of the boogeyman of white supremacy, it's the Klan that comes to mind, and rightfully so. But they're very poorly organized. They're fractured, splintered. The so-called alt-right is a much bigger threat. They're very sophisticated with online recruiting. They have very slick messengers. They have, one of their own is, in the Oval Office, or his coterie of advisors. I mean, Stephen Miller is a second-degree Proud Boy. That's right. And Steve Bannon was the editor of Breitbart, which is, the platform for the alt-right. So this goes, from the very top. So we knew from the beginning, yes, that was the much bigger threat. That the August 12th Unite the Right rally was scarier, and so people were afraid of coming out, and also, feeling that they bought the argument that this was going to just feed the flames, and I said no, and we just had another torch rally. I can't even keep track of them anymore. This was Saturday, a few days ago. Richard Spencer and company showed up again for another torch rally in one of our parks, and it was very clear that some of us were there actually interacting with them. It was a group of about 40 or 50 of them. What they actually want is they want acquiescence. They want to show up in public uncontested. That's their true goal, actually. As long as we keep showing up, and I was so heartened to see, the outpouring here in Boston. I mean, not only after August 12th in Charlottesville, but when you had your own contingent, of alt-right folks showing up, that just the massive showing up in the streets, That's important to have a public rebuke, to have the message just be so clear from the community that we reject this. That is the most important thing that can happen. Not battening down the hatches and staying home and hovering in your house and not showing up, or just ignore them. This is what our mayor told us to do. This is our leadership. This is our elected leadership.
Well, not just the mayor. So even in the religious community, it was very conflicted, and we had, there's a few convening bodies of interfaith leaders and clergy in Charlottesville. But certainly the mayor has, at a couple different points in time, as has the chief of police, tried to use that as a platform to get clergy and faith leaders to be, to kind of serve their will, that, just
of the state.
Yeah. And at one point, my husband spoke up, who I'm so proud of, and who said, the state which is licensed to carry and use weapons needs to ask us how to be peacemakers and never the other way around. So, he's pretty popular with, with the elected officials these days. But it's true. But even that we say that, and you say moral clarity in retrospect, but in the moment, and so this is we've been thinking about this because the clergy response in Charlottesville, granted there are many ways to show up that day, and not everyone walked into the park, and at every single training, we even said, if you walk into the park, you should plan on being arrested and be prepared to get injured. And so, all that to say,
you warned us about the threats to our life before August 12th.
Up into and including death. And so certainly not everyone should go into the park. And if you go, you need to know why you are showing up. and be prepared for those things. So that being said, there were many different ways, and I think in the end, the clergy line that walked into the park was about 50, and we had several hundred who were serving in adjacent or in infrastructure positions, from care bears to medics to legal observation, those kinds of roles. But then clergy specifically who were doing different things adjacent to the park. But we also struggled we had so many conversations, and my husband and our dear friend and colleague, Brittany Kane Conley, my husband's name is Seth Wispelwey, who's also an ordained UCC minister, they specifically had conversations with so many white clergy of liberal communities about why to show up, and those people seemed to struggle the most with why. But we also had, as during the civil rights movement, we had institutions, African American leaders in the community who were institutions, and religious leaders who didn't want anything to do with possible civil disobedience. And that triggered a lot of white people who didn't know where they stood to be like, okay. Yeah. So that we saw that. We also saw a whole lot of people who didn't know where they stood, proverbially and literally. And we also saw a lot of privilege. I'm speaking, more of white communities, but there were a number of white pastors who had vacations and were like, well, I have a vacation planned. So, and that's hard. And I don't, individually, these are my colleagues and friends. And of course I understand. Right. But when I look back convicted about the way that I believe whiteness was at work in that, even because if we care for our city collectively, and no one was like, well, I can't be there, so let's make sure someone can be there. Those conversations never happened. And I also didn't see, with a few small exceptions, churches show up, and I speak specifically to to the Christian communities in Charlottesville now. Churches show up together. There were a lot of associate pastor women, some of whom risked their jobs, and there were some wonderful activists, lay leaders. But in terms of like whole communities embracing the process and saying we're going to show up, we really didn't experience that a lot. So those are, and we're lamenting, and I'm part of that. Part of kind of that process.
Thank you. I want to hear a little bit more about how religion played a role in the counter-protests themselves, beyond just clergy showing up, the role of ritual, the role of song, the role of worship. But before we do that, Willie.
Oh, yeah.
Bring us to Boston.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some of these debates were happening there, but also thinking about these larger questions of the consequences when people of faith don't show up. What it means for the church or the places of worship. What it means for our communities.
I think the conversations that were happening in Charlottesville are no different anywhere in the country when unrest like this happens. How do we respond? I think people of faith have always struggled with notions of respectability and in response to power. And how am I supposed to position myself as a person of faith in respects to the state? And I think even in the moment, we're miles away from Charlottesville, but we heard the exact same conversations. You opened the paper and you saw the very drastically different responses to the exact same incident. And I'm looking at myself like, how did you get that out of this? Like, if anything, we all should say, no, we can't have this anymore. And my question becomes, what do we do if we don't say nothing? What happens if we just ignore it and act like it's not there? And I think we as a country have done that too often. We've acted like things aren't there that are very, very present. I think some of the shock is that we've ignored these voices that have been very, very present for a long time. And now these voices have been emboldened by political power. from the top all the way down to the lay. Now these voices feel that they have comfort to speak in ways in which they haven't spoken in a long time. And everyone is shocked that we no longer live in a world where those voices are the minority. And I would even push back to argue that they never really have been the minority. That in Charlottesville, I'm from Georgia, so when you're talking about Confederate statues, I can't go downtown without seeing one. I remember as a child seeing these conversations around the Confederate flag and how do we change the state flag. These aren't new conversations, folks. This has been a part of the fabric of this country, and we know that we have a responsibility, and folks have been doing this for a long time. And so I think what we saw here in Boston was a beautiful display, but we didn't really get to see the struggle that it took to bring people together. And I'm just so proud of a sister like Monica Cannon, who's my neighbor across the street in Roxbury, who's a lay sister who started that movement by herself, literally with a Facebook post and a couple text messages. And she said, will you support me? I'm like, yeah, I got your back. I've always got your back. But it wasn't even that religious that started that response. It was somebody who was in the community who said, we're not going to stand for that. And how do we as church folk or people of faith align in solidarity with people who may not be as overtly in positions of power as the pastor or as the assistant pastor? Because the work of justice still needs to be done no matter what. And so there are people who are putting their voices out there, but I think there is a conversation to be had here at the Divinity School, across faith traditions writ large, about what does it mean to really do justice. I'm of the belief that it doesn't mean going back and just being quiet and praying about it without any action.
Or writing a tweet.
You can write a tweet, as long as you get out there and walk a little bit. I saw Carrie Maloney out there. It was good to see Carrie at the march, because I know she knows what it means to do justice. It means that you can't just talk about it, you have to actually be about it. You have to speak about it, but you also have to act about it. And the work that is necessary for us as people of faith, because when you're in positions like a pastor, assistant pastor, you're a deacon, people look to you. There's a responsibility. Professors, your students look to you. And they want to know, what are you going to do? And how are you going to shape this conversation so it makes sense to me that I have the right response? And in Boston, one of the things that made me speak was that we needed to be able to say it's okay to not feel good about racism. It's okay to push back against power. It's okay to say we're going to stand up on the side of what is right. And if they come to our city, we're going to show up in large numbers and ensure that our voices are heard. Nobody's pulling a race card here. It's overt. And we have to make sure that we do that. But racism is sneaky because it operates on a continuum. So we can talk about just the overt representations, but we also have to talk about the systemic representations of racism each and every day, whether it's in our school systems, whether it's in our police forces, whether it's in our public safety, whatever it may be. Because Boston has its issues in itself. You're talking about a majority white police force. You're talking about a 90% fire department force. You're talking about the fact that many people in this city do not reap the benefits of the outpouring that we saw on that day. So it was an eerie feeling, right? The majority of people at that march didn't look like me. They didn't look like my brother who was with me. They looked like the majority of the people in this body. And so the question is, the very folk that we were fighting for weren't even in the march mostly. And why? And how do we address that conversation? How do we deal with those tough conversations intracommunally? How do we deal with those conversations intergenerationally? Because it is true that some of the older ministers are like, well, I ain't going to be out there marching like that. I'm going to leave that to y'all young boys. And that's okay. But I need to know where you stand. Because when the rubber meets the road, I need to know that I'm going to speak out and I'm going to have some support. But even if I don't, I'm going to say what I need to say anyway. And so I think what we have to do, when I was in Ferguson, they asked me, why y'all come down here? I said, what are you going to do afterwards? And my response was simply, there's a Ferguson near you. That the reason we speak out is because these injustices are not just in Charlottesville. It'd be unfair to put all of this on them. It's happening here in Boston. It's happening in DC. It's happening in New York. It's happening across the country writ large. And just because your city didn't get the media attention this time, doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to speak up, to speak out, and to do justice.
Amen. I'm going to open it up to Q&A to all of you in a little bit, so prepare yourselves. But before I do that, Tracy, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how religion showed up on August 12th and before.
Open up the gates. Open up the gates of justice. Open up the gates. Open up the gates of justice. We're gonna walk on through. We're gonna walk on through to the other side. We're gonna walk on through. Don't pay no mind to that old statue. Sing that with me. Open up the gates. Open up the gates of justice. Open up the gates of justice. Again.
Open up the gates. Open up the gates of justice.
We're gonna walk on through. We're gonna walk on through to the other side. We're gonna walk on through. Don't pay no mind to that old statue. We'll sing it out if you forgot. Black and brown are beautiful children of God. We'll sing it out if you forgot. Black and brown are beautiful children of God. We'll sing it out if you forgot. Trans and queer are beautiful children of God. We'll sing it out if you forgot. Immigrants are beautiful children of God.
Amen.
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 You showed up.
So I worked with a rabbi and a Muslim leader in town, and the three of us planned the interfaith service prior to the 12th. So on Friday night, we put together liturgy and songs and readings from different traditions. I also am a songwriter and a music producer, and I wrote half a dozen songs and prepared about 12 hours of what I would consider resistance liturgy that was intended to be part of the direct action. And then at the last minute was not, because of different ways the police had barricaded the area, the decision that both my husband and I did not want to be in equal kind of proximity to violence and different things, that did not happen. But there was a lot of preparation and interfaith connection that happened. And so we're all Christian here, unfortunately, but yeah, the effort in Charlotte, unfortunately.
For distribution.
Yeah.
You know what she means.
But yeah, it was very much an interfaith effort. And my dear friend, well, both of our friends who, this young Muslim woman who's a PhD student at UVA, she's a hijabi woman, and she is one of our best activists and so faithful, and she was committed to showing up, and we like all of us, we didn't want that to happen. And that, actually, when you were speaking, what I thought of, when we issued the clergy call, we issued a national call to religious leaders, but with a specific appeal to white men, because that day we knew that everybody was a target. There was no safe space, but anyone who was going to be identifiably other was going to be in that much extra of real bodily danger. We did have one hijabi woman on the line, and bless her, Sahar Al-Sani. I think in the civil rights movement, before civil disobedience, there was often a prayer gathering that would happen the night before. And so in that kind of same spirit, we sought to frame what we're doing. And again, this we recognize this might not have been the case for other activists and activist groups in the city. But for the faith leaders that came, we had a few intersecting claims from our faith traditions and things that compelled us to show up in an embodied way. And so we highlighted those, we celebrated those, we interceded in the name of that part of our tradition, and we also offered an altar call for anyone feeling compelled to do civil disobedience. I mean, that would happen in the civil rights movement. So that was all part of the service, and framing that it's not just, I think part of the struggle that I hear from organizers, certainly the struggle and what I have to resist in the interest of being able to stay in the movement of the action of love, working towards a sustained justice and not just reacting towards these crises, is to remain connected to this story and these legacies. And so it was an attempt to connect to these legacies of ancestors, generations past and future, and find ourselves in this moment together.
And I know from being there that those rituals and practices and songs and performing worship in that space as the rally was going on provided a great strength and spiritual resilience that allowed you to be there.
I should say, so Tracy planned the August 11 Friday night it's kind of prayer service, to kind of fortify folks, and it was, Tracy Blackman was there, gave a barn burner of a sermon. There were 500 people just packed in there in this Episcopal church, and then the plan was to, after the barn burner of a sermon and all these,
and the altar call,
and there would be the altar call, that it would funnel into a mass session of training for nonviolent direct action for anyone that hadn't received training, so that they would be prepared for the next morning in the parks, right? But what happened was that while we were there in that service that Tracy had planned with such care, was that across the street was a torch rally with several hundred Nazis had come in with their torches and were attacking students and all of this. And we were told to shelter in place, and it was just a very scary situation and a lot of confusion as hundreds of people were trapped in the church. I was tweeting from the church, just in desperation, out of there, because by then it was on the news, I think, that this rally was happening, and then across the street, here we are, trapped in there with hundreds of people. So there was that, and then, I was trying to think of kind of other religious responses too. I mean, this kind of unfortunately derailed.
There was the direct action in the line. So we started Saturday morning. So not much sleep on Friday night. Saturday morning was a sunrise service as well.
Right, that's it. At the Black Baptist Church that was founded by freedmen right after the Civil War.
Yeah.
So that was important.
And that was the launching place from which both clergy, religious leaders would march out on the line into the park and also march into adjacent areas. And there were clergy there all day. You can even share. Well, you can share, where you were and kind of the response you saw.
Yeah. Well, I'm just very struck by there was prayer that was being said by those who were on the line in front of Emancipation Park, but also at the scene of where the car attack happened. Their clergy showed up there, and we're offering pastoral care. We're offering prayer for the survivors and the medics who are taking care of them. But there was also for me, being worshiping God in the midst of that, as all of that was going on. The rally, the Unite the Right rally at Emancipation Park, in a church that was just adjacent to it, and particularly the recitation of Psalm 46. God is a very present help in trouble. The God of refuge was incredibly powerful to recite those words, those ancient words in that space, and to feel a comfort that came from that. But it's also very jarring, this juxtaposition of candles and prayers and mantras being said within the church, and then outside, torches and mantras being said for very different life dealing and death dealing, very different purposes.
And when they announced inside the church that the Nazis were outside doing this, we doubled down, and Reverend Sekou said, we're going to sing even loud. I mean, we sang and we clapped and we stomped even. I mean, we were just singing through our fear. We didn't know if they were going to come in and attack us or not. We knew there were a lot of them out there. And we, it was like, who knows what's going to happen? And this is the night before, mind you. This is the night before. And
Yeah.
and so we just started singing and clapping and praying, you know, even louder. You know what I mean? I mean, for me, I had even more resolve. And I'm like, oh, hell no. They're not going to turn me away. You know what I mean? But also a fear. You know?
I will say, though, that the next day, I got a little sick of this little light of mine. There was a lot of this little light of mine.
But also I would say, I mean, the service on Saturday morning that was at the beginning, you know, before the march to the parks, you know, I was hugging someone also from Black Lives Matter there, and it was, you know, it was 8 in the morning, his shirt was already soaked with sweat, and we were both crying.
Yeah.
And we were crying. Well, I know why I was crying, because I knew it was 8 in the morning on Saturday morning. We'd just come out of church. We were, you know, on the way to the park, you know. And I knew already, somewhere, somehow, someone was going to die that day. I mean, it was just
Death came.
It was just clear, especially after that torch rally, not before. I'm like, oh, they're out for blood, you know.
Thank you. I'd like to open up the discussion to all of you. We have Francesca with a microphone, so please raise your hand if there is a question that you would like to offer. We have one over here, Francesca. And I ask that you just say who you are and then briefly ask your question so we can get as many in as possible.
So I want to say thank you to the presenters. And my name is Angel Calvin, by the way. I am a second-year student here at the Divinity School. I'm also a UVA alum, and 2014. And so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. But first, I want to commend everyone who organized throughout the summer, even facing militarized police response and still feeling the courage to continue in August. As a UVA alum, a Black UVA alum, I can look back at my experience at UVA with some nostalgia because of my Black experience there. The Black community there is very vibrant and does have a history and rooted in combating white supremacist structures there and carving out a place for itself there. And so my question is one related to UVA specifically because I see their engagement with, they're an institution that has power in Charlottesville. And white supremacy is ultimately, it's rooted in the spiritual, but it's driven by institutions. And UVA is a powerful institution in the city that has a voice. And so I'm wondering, what are clergy doing or others doing in the area even after the rallies to really, I guess, address the structures that helped white supremacy to continue to persist, which UVA is complicit in. Even as someone who can look back and say I enjoy my experience there, I also know that it is complicit in allowing that to persist. And I believe that the spiritual and the institutional are intertwined. So how are clergy also working on addressing structural, the structural aspects even after the rally? And that's not just for Charlottesville, but for cities across the nation as well.
And is your question in particular the structural issues with respect to universities? And how are they targeting universities or thinking about universities in this, or even broader?
I guess I'm trying to say that it's an institution that is very powerful. When people think of Charlottesville, they think of UVA.
Okay.
And so their voice, their actions, their legacy, and they've sown the seeds, in essence, to allow something like August 12th to happen. And so I think it's important to also, I always see the institutional as important when it comes to the spiritual.
Great.
And so I'm wondering what action clergy are taking when it comes to really, I guess, kind of attacking, for lack of a better word, just the complicity of institutions.
Thank you, Angela.
I can respond a little bit in terms of campus ministry, and then Jalane has a intimate relationship with the university. So I was a campus minister working with university students at UVA for the 3 years prior to starting this current role. And I absolutely agree with you that the Black Student Association, other Black and people of color-led organizations at the University of Virginia were, prior to the movement landing in Charlottesville, at the front line of just bringing that awareness and continuing legacy to the community. And so it was in 2014, I believe, that the Black Student Association released a comprehensive document called Towards a Better University. And it's, I mean, you can Google it. It's still a comprehensive document that everything from increasing faculty of color, really what I heard you saying, like addressing the institution, to unmask. And my colleague from the UCC here was talking about some of their racial justice curriculum. They go through the process of unmasking, dismantling, and eradicating. And this document and the efforts that continue are really at every level, from student life to memorialization and public memory. In terms of clergy, there's the ministers in the interfaith group that works with students. It's also a Jeffersonian model. Like, the students very much lead that. But there's, for the last 3 years, also been Holy Week of Resistance geared towards seeking to abolish state-sanctioned violence, but in the context of the university, which then looks like paying a living wage to all the laborers, lamenting inadequate response and rebuke to really violent, spiritually violent, and physically violent threats against marginalized communities. I think, everything is different post-12th. So what it will continue to look at, I can say in the city that the energy is focusing around housing, as it is in a lot of cities.
Mm-hmm.
And dealing with that creatively, and also in the very just kind of policy level. But for the university, then the students, 3 students were arrested last week at the bicentennial celebration for holding up a sign that said 200 years of slavery. So there's, in some instances, I believe UVA is having a genuine process, as good as any I've seen, and then in other areas, things like this happened, and I'm just beside myself. In post-12, I'm a lot more skeptical because of the just complete denial. And denial is if I give them the benefit of the doubt. Yeah. I would say much more there's a lot of dishonesty and not coming forward with what was known and why the university police allowed that to happen. Can you imagine any other group marching through with torches, not being stopped immediately and arrested?
Jalane, do you want to add something brief before we take another question?
Yeah, I can't really speak to what clergy are doing. Tracy's, of course, much more close to that. But I'd say there's been an uptick in folks that are attending meetings about affordable housing and going to those kind of policy meetings. That's been an outward. I talk about condensation and dissipation when I talk about white supremacy, and these monuments are hunks of metal that are there that are condensed symbols of a white supremacist slave-holding regime, republic, Another condensation moment was performative, which is these rallies that are coming. So these are very visible moments of condensation of white supremacy. But the dissipation is arguably as or more toxic, because the organism breathes it in, these aerated particles, and it affects the organism and to death. And so anyway, there's been, I think, people are making more of a connection between those, the symbolism and the so-called alt-right and the organizing around the country, and then what's going on locally here with affordable housing. There's been more interest in that, I would say.
Any other burning questions? We have one here. Maybe we could take a couple questions, since we're running out of time, and we can try to answer as many of them as possible.
Hi, I'm Arlene Preloy. I'm a member of the Alumni Council here and a graduate of 2013. Mm-hmm. My question really has to do with spiritual resources for the people who participated and how they sustain themselves after going through the trauma of the march, and also for you as individuals to sustain you for the next time, for the next move. What is keeping you? What are you reading? What are you doing? What are you sharing with others?
Thank you. Dudley?
I think we're listening to them.
We're going to take a few questions and try to get in as many as possible.
One of the things that I was struck by in watching Charlottesville unfold was how much not only racism, but anti-Semitism and other kinds of bigotry were in evidence. And I'm just wondering how any of you see the future of fighting against all of those together. If that's, is that a possibility? Do they have to, does that fragment things too much? It seems to me that the whole thing with immigrants and with Muslims, for example, all are being raised in the same set of events.
Mm-hmm. We had a couple questions over here, Franny.
Hi, good evening. I am Carlene Griffith-Sekou. I was one of the core organizers for the march here in Boston. Monica Cannon put the flyer out. She contacted organizers from Black Lives Matter, Boston, Cambridge, and our network was mobilized to organize the march in Boston. My particular role was to organize clergy and organize the nonviolent direct action trainings, and Carrie came out, Stephanie Paulsell was a part of that. It's very critical to say, if we're comparing or learning lessons from both contexts, that sitting at the table, the core organizers consisted of not only local Black Lives Matter network, but a national network. These are folk who were on Ferguson. These are folk who responded in Baltimore. These are folk who were on the front lines of day in and day out organizing, putting their bodies on the line. And our strategy not only drew from the civil rights movement of the sanitized king that we know, but we also know that Boston is a city, the clergy, many of whom were having those conversations, have also been primarily disengaged and practice sort of the symbolic representation of what the gospel means, rather than the embodied representation where you put your life on the line, where the rubber meets the road. And so there was a lot of distrust of clergy because Boston still remains very segregated. There are a lot of interfaith dialogical groups that talk, but there is also a lot of factions. And so the Black Ministerial Alliance was distrusted. We had a deep conversation about that. The varying interfaith groups that met at Temple Beth Israel, we had a contingency that came out, and there were clergy who came out, many committed, many curious, to ultimately decide what to do. And in part, it was because it was women, Black, queer, LGBTQ, immigrants, all of the cross sections that that theologically divide not only the Black church, but the city was the dividing line. Because these are the people that are constitutive of the Black Lives Matter movement, we felt that it was imperative that when we put out a call for clergy, that they understood if you come, you're coming for queer, Black, women, LGBTQ, immigrants, right, transgendered, you're coming for Jewish folk, you're coming for all of us. This is why Black Lives Matter says until Black Lives Matter, no one's life matters. Because our imagination is not as it has ever been before, to include a humanity and a representation of the gospel that we have not seen and that does not bear fruit in moments like this when the rubber meets the road, right? So I will stop there to say this. The other dividing line was that we were clear with the city, we're not partnering with the police. We expect that they will be there. We expect that they will do their job. We expect the protection, but we also knew that if you're Black, queer, and all of the other groups that are terrorized in our neighborhoods, in Willie's neighborhood, in Monica's neighborhood, in Roxbury and Dorchester, we were not safe either. So if you were white and you were not an ally and not simply an accomplice, but a freedom fighter in solidarity, being willing to lay your lives down, your job was to protect us.
Thank you.
To
Thank
serve
you for
as a
offering
border
that context.
between the police and the people. And so Antifa served as our protection. My question, sorry, for the Boston context, this is really important to acknowledge that women, queer, Black led, and non-clergy, very much led by moral, ethical principles.
Absolutely.
Because the gospel means that we lay our lives down and that all of us are in the same boat. That white folk, Jewish folk, they're not coming to fight a civil rights movement for Black people any longer. White people are implicated in this moment, and white supremacy is also, right? White folk are also the first victims of white supremacy. So when you show up, we're showing up as a humanity with a different imagination. My question for you is, I've seen that Antifa intervened in a most significant way to protect and lay their bodies down. And symbolically and materially, they represent the gospel to many people more so than clergy in garb, marching, locked arms, which is beautiful. It's not to take anything from that. But we knew this moment required something differently. And our organizing drew from every faction of our community. So when we put out the call, they showed up.
Yeah.
So the role of Antifa, and where do you stand or see them in light of their action in that day? We don't have to talk about their ideology or philosophy, but how the religious shows up in the role that they played here, as well as in your protests. Thank you for letting me
and thank you for
say
giving
that.
that greater context about Boston, which is very useful to hear. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and so I know there were further questions, and I wish I had more opportunity, more time for all of our speakers to answer all of those questions, but I might ask you to do the impossible and to offer a word in conclusion that speaks to some of these questions of spiritual resources, of Antifa, of the intersectionality of the many issues that are being raised right now. As a conclusion, Willie?
Well, I guess I'll start trying to do the impossible. To speak to Carlene's point, I think the movement looked different here. It wasn't a clergy-led movement. And to be honest, a lot of the movements that we saw over the last 10 years haven't been clergy-led. And I think that's kind of made the country uncomfortable in some way, because we don't know what it looks like without religious-led leadership. But it's okay, right? The work of justice doesn't have to be led by a preacher. I think there's some humility, right, to do justice and to walk humbly. And I think one of the things that we as clergy can also understand is that we don't have any autonomy over the justice work. I think there's a lesson in that. And so where is the role of Antifa? Is the role where we all should be standing is, what does it mean to sacrifice? And how do we sacrifice for the other? How do we sacrifice for our brother? How do we sacrifice for our sister? And those roles should be embodied by anyone, and we should acknowledge that when we see it. I can't speak to everyone's ideology. I can't speak to everyone's beliefs. But what I can say is that it shouldn't matter who's doing the justice. We should just recognize that it is justice. And so I give great credit to the Black women who led the march, the Black queer women, transgender women, whoever it may have been, because I was there in solidarity. I had no issue, because my goal is to do justice, to walk humbly, to love mercy. And in doing that, you don't really worry about who's doing the work. You stand with the work if it's for the right thing. And so I think the sacrifice, we can't deny the sacrifice of those who put their bodies on the line. We can't deny the sacrifice of those who are willing to make sure that others are protected so that the justice work can be done. I would never stand, and I couldn't integrally stand and do that. But I think, just so I may close this conversation for myself up, and I promise you I'll be done right here. What the question also was asked, yeah, please, yeah. But the question was also asked was about, what are we doing to actually continue this discourse. I'm a former football player. I can't help but say I haven't watched an NFL game this year, even after my Falcons lost to the Patriots. Dudley. I haven't watched a game this year because I think there's something interesting that has been happening in this country now, and I want to leave this on our minds about what is happening where there's become a conversation around prophetic witness and patriotism. And how some way, somehow, having a prophetic witness has been juxtaposed to patriotism. So much so that to speak towards power means to be unpatriotic. And I think that dichotomy has kind of shaped where we are right now. And it's always kind of been the foundations of this country. To speak back towards power means you're being un-American, but I'm reminded of Baldwin who says, I love this country dearly, so I continually to critique her often. And so I think what we should be thinking about in this moment is what does it truly mean to be prophetic in this moment? What does it mean to have a voice for justice? What does it mean to have a voice of love? How do we actually do the hard work of doing the intersectional combining of movements to actually push back against power and saying to the state doesn't control the people are the state, right? We dictate what the state does. And so I think we have to really criticize the traditions that have been built around the ideals of this country, which have been rooted in a non-neutral framework. They have been rooted in favor of those who are white. But we have a world that is so different. We have gays, we have lesbians, we have blacks, we have whites, we have people of all faith traditions. And we have set a standard so great and so grand that we want to live up to it. And I'm telling you that we're going to have to fight to do it. We're going to stand up to do it. And we can't be silent, especially as people of faith and people who have studied these issues. We have a moment right now to actually speak truth to power and to bring clarity to a country that is caught in a moment of confusion.
Thank you. Michael, the word of God cannot be contained. I'm going to, with your permission, and I know that some people may need to leave, and that's perfectly fine, but I also want to give an opportunity to Tracy and Jalane to give a brief 1 or 2 lines of final reflection.
Sure. So thank you so much for those thoughtful questions. They're so important. And in a response, I don't have the sense that the organizing and the action in Charlottesville at all is clergy-led. No. Clergy were completely collaborating and even taking a backseat to Black Lives Matter and some of the other activists in the city, and it was a collective decision to send clergy out into the park. So that's important to know. I completely agree with you, and our hope was that white freedom fighters would do that. When we put the clergy call out, we made that special appeal. We also needed people that were trained, and by and large, the people that were willing to come and the people that were trained were people of color, women, LGBTQ people who have been in it. And so I think that there were 3 white cis male people, or white cis male faith leaders on the line in front when you see the pictures of people that went on the park, of the 50 that went into the park. So that was just a little bit of a reflection and just clarifying to make sure that we were very much like
Thank you.
The role of Antifa. I think you're right. I mean, there's a lot to be said that there was a gospel moment for a lot of people that were on the line, and the story's been told over and over, but Antifa directly intervened and saved the literal bodies of a lot of the clergy that were there.
In Cornell West.
Yeah, including my husband, including others, and that is when I seek to see the gospel alive in the world, not project what I think it should be in the characters. I can't help but notice that. I do think I hear what you say, and I agree with you in ideology. But it does matter to me when I'm standing with someone who doesn't believe women should be ordained. It affects the trust that I have in that person, and that's a struggle along the way. So that's not to say that I don't walk side by side with people and struggle, but I don't completely feel, because we're going to break through whatever we're dealing with, and eventually we're going to have to turn to face each other. And I do think that what I have come to terms with as someone who served in a white liberal church that championed LGBTQ rights, but who doesn't know that they're a white church, who hasn't, can't articulate what the force of their whiteness is. And then I see, kind of more patriarchal black churches who have been on the front lines of racial justice and systemic work, and who yet are not quite, or who are not there. Yeah. I can't now. I have a harder time distinguishing those things, but I do think we are ultimately working for collective liberation, and I absolutely think that's what the gospel, as I understand it, is moving us towards.
To stop there, thank you, Jalane. Literally, can we get one line of final advice or reflection from you? You have the impossible task.
Okay, well, Charlottesville is happening. This is coming to you, folks. It's not just because we have these Confederate monuments and we have, but this is coming to you. Yeah. The so-called alt-right is organizing. They have their man in the White House. We're living under an authoritarian regime that week by week, you see the news, that there's just one thing after another, this is a crisis for liberal democratic institutions, all right? And the sorts of training and frameworks that we have, even the stuff I was taught here, we're very much challenged by this, but the need for public witness continues.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you. Margaret Rose, will you take us out?
Could I make a public service announcement quickly?
Can you do it after we've formally concluded? And we'll make sure you get your chance. Thank you.
Well, I think it's clear. Divinity dialogues are not meant to be a spectator sport, but to engage us all, not only in this conversation, but also in all kinds of public voice and witness. And so this is an invitation to continue to do that. We'll do that in our council. I know that you'll do that among yourselves and beyond. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you.